The discourse on race is avoided often because it's packed with emotion, controversy, and division. Yet, there are a few persons who have chosen to address the subject quite frontally. Among them is Dr. David Hinds, who has just published a book, Race and Political Discourse in Guyana, a conversation with African Guyanese. To assist me in talking with Dr. Hinds about his book is Dr. Alissa Trotz, first-time guest on St. Doug. And Alissa, thank you very much for joining us. And David, as usual, thanks for coming. The issue of race is almost like raising a hornet's nest. Why have you chosen to address this question so publicly and on record?
Well, part of it is that I wanted to continue a tradition that was started by AUC Guyana, who I think was the first public person in the modern period to really frontally address this question of race, when in 1961 he raised the issue of joint premiership, which we today call power sharing and all that stuff, and really drawing the country's attention to the fact that the solidarity that we saw in 1953 around the original PPP that was fractured when the nationalist movement split in 1955, that by the turn of the 1960s, that it had resulted in a kind of open antagonism between Africans and Indians. And Guyana at that time, along with H.H. Nicholson and Tom Dalgett, who was part of that group, formed something called the African Society for Racial Equality, and they raised this question frontally. Raising it, of course, from the standpoint of African Guyanese, but one cannot talk about race and African Guyanese without talking about Indian Guyanese, and indeed all the other races. And at that time, Guyana argued that in order to avoid what he saw as a disaster in terms of racial violence coming on, this was 1961, he said that in order to avoid it, what was needed was that the leadership of the two groups, the parties, the PPP and the PNC, should really sit down and hammer out a national government on what he called a joint premiership between Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan at the time. And of course, that was long before people started to write about power sharing and all of that. Of course, that proposal was rejected by both Dr. Jagan and Mr. Burnham. Guyana was expelled from the PNC for daring to make that proposal, because he did say that as a last resort, if the leaders did not agree to joint premiership, then as a last resort to really ensure that Africans and Indians did not fight each other, that they should be partitioned. The country should be partitioned with an Indian zone, an African zone, and they also proposed what they call a free zone. That is, people of Indians and Indian African descent and Chinese who didn't want to live in these two things could live in this free zone. And of course, today we only hear about the partition aspect of it, and we don't hear about joint premiership. So I wanted to continue that tradition started by Guyana, of course picked up later on by people like Moses Bhagwan and Walter Rodney, the WPA, and Rafi Dev of late. So not to avoid this question, but to address it frontally, because it is perhaps the biggest obstacle to forward movement in Guyana. Certainly it has been for the last 50 years.
Dr. Trotz, if I may bring you in, do you believe, and you've done research work on the subject in your own thesis, is that right? Now, do you believe Guyana is ready for that discourse?
I think I want to say yes, but I think it's not so much a question of whether we're ready as it is a question of it becoming a political necessity, a political imperative. And it seems to me that if we follow David's line of thought, I think one of the things that we can understand is that the decade of the 1960s, we're talking about a collective trauma being experienced by the entire nation. A collective trauma that unfortunately is not understood as a collective trauma, but is rather seen by one or the other side, either African or Indian. And one of the tragedies of this, in addition to the riots that occurred in the 1960s in Guyana, is the fact that when we think about the current political landscape, one would believe that there are only African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese, and they only all live on the coast. So other groups like Amerindians, other groups within those two racial groups, like women, like the disabled, like children, their concerns, their specific issues of violence against women, become completely obliterated because of this loyalty to one's race or the other. So I think because of that collective trauma, and because of the fact that that collective trauma is spoken of as I was victimized as an African, or I was victimized as an Indian, and it's always the other side. So it's either the other side was the aggressor, or it was that I was oppressed more than you. So it's a lot of talking to, but not sharing and listening on. I think because of the way in which that collective trauma has been dealt with. So I think that there actually has been conversation about race. The conversation, unfortunately, has ended up making the situation much worse. But it does seem to me that we're at a political juncture now where we have no choice but to confront this issue. We're dealing with a situation where I think violence has become endemic to the society. We're dealing with a political situation where, as Rupert Ryan had said a couple of years ago, the interesting thing in Guyana around free and fair elections in a racially divided country is that the better the elections, the deeper the racial crisis. I think that in this sort of context, the political imperative is for us to find a way out of this by talking to each other. And this comes out of the 1960s, but this is something that goes way back to the colonial era. And I think we need to understand the extent to which we are simply repeating the sorts of ways in which we have been set up against each other since Africans and Indians were brought to this land to labor on the sugar plantation, that we continue to work in a way that completely undermines the common source of interest that we have in this country.
Does this bring us back to this question of, and again we quote AUC Guyana, no guilty race, but the fact that the races always take the other side is really the guilty one.
Yes, definitely, Chris. And I want to say that I'm locating this work in the tradition of AUC Guyana. I think we don't often give him the credit for the labor that he has put in to addressing some of these issues. As I said, he was the first person to public figure, to deal with this issue of race, and he has been stereotyped as a racial person and so on, for daring to deal with this question. And I think in 1998, when he wrote the book, No Guilty Race, he gave us once again an opening, and it is that opening that I try to exploit in the book, because principally the thesis of the book is that yes, there is no guilty race, in the sense that both races from time to time have been aggressors, both have behaved in a certain kind of way, both have resorted to violence from time to time. But at the end of the day, if you say one was more guilty than the other, or one is innocent and the other one is guilty, then you're not advancing the conversation, because you pose the conversation. You are guilty, I'm innocent, there's nothing to talk about. And so therefore, I'm saying there is a lot to talk about. And as an African Guyanese, I understand that community a little better than I understand the Indian Guyanese community. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to talk to both races, but to talk to them from my standpoint as an African Guyanese, because I think that there is a way in which as an African Guyanese I can address African Guyanese that I can't address Indian Guyanese in the same way. But when I speak to African Guyanese, I'm also speaking to Indian Guyanese, because there's a relationship. There's a relationship there. So yes, no guilty race, and I think Guyana has given us a wonderful opening to really discuss this issue, and to discuss it in a very sensible way. I was elated the other day to see Mr. Robert Corbyn quoting no guilty race. And in fact, it's been quoted up and down, wherever Guyanese find themselves, the concept of no guilty race. And I want to say that is what has inspired this book that I have written here.
Any comments you want to make on the Guyana issue and no guilty race, or whether one is more guilty than the other?
No, I mean, what I would do is probably take it a little further back in time to situate that, because maybe we can come back to that later. The point I want to make is that it is important to understand the 1960s in a historical perspective. It's important to understand the contemporary crisis we are currently in, and the fact that we seem to be repeating many of the mistakes of the 1960s simply because the silence continues to be unbroken, or the conversations that we have are not at all productive. And it seems to me that a historical sense, which is one of the points that David makes very strongly in the book, a historical sense is really what we need in order to understand where we have come today. And I think it is not just David and AUC, but also Walter Rodney, who in the history of the Guyanese working people begins his book by reminding everyone how many million tons of mud have to be moved to make this coast that we take for granted, except when there are floods, but that we take for granted possible, that made Guyana possible. In other words, Walter's book makes the point that all of this human work, all of this labor, all of the sacrifices of working people who are both African and Indian were necessary for Guyana to be made possible. And it seems to me that one of the crises, and perhaps I'd like to come back to this historical question, but one of the crises today is that we take the sacrifices of working people for granted, the sacrifices of those who continue to make this place, Guyana, possible. It would not be possible were it not for the ongoing work of people. And I think that's the point that Walter Rodney made. And that as people work, as they labor, as they create, they give meaning to what they create. They give meaning to this space called Guyana. They give meaning to who they understand themselves to be. And sometimes, unfortunately, the meaning they give to who they understand themselves to be is not always of their own making, is not always by choice. Might have to do with other kinds of powers. And I think, to me, understanding that history is critical to seeing ourselves, one as Guyanese, but also to understanding why it is we seem to be repeating this cycle of who contributed more, who is more Guyanese than who could rule this country more than who. If you really wanted to have that conversation, then we should be talking about Amerindian people who were here before any of these other groups came to Guyana, and that never seems to come to the table.
And I want to pick up Chris there, because I think Alissa introduced the what I would call the salient question here. What we have is a reality before us, and the reality before us is that we have a one-party government, and that party is dominated by one race, represents one race, and we have that party in government. In a government structure where the winner takes all, so that you win, and you win control of the executive branch, the legislative branch, by extension, the judicial branch, the local government. You have total power. Now, here are African people who dug those canals and moved all of that. And they're sitting in a country in which they don't see themselves as part of the power structure. On the other hand, they are working class Indian people, ordinary Indian people, whose name, the government is ruling in their name, but they themselves do not have any say in what's going on. So you have race and you have class. You hear black people of all classes will say, but we are not represented in this government. We don't have a say in this country that we've labored to build, that we've contributed to in no small way.
And that we continue now by way of taxes, by way of providing our labor.
Exactly. And so therefore, the conversation becomes a conversation about purely race, because these Africans really do not see that the ordinary Indian people, the Indian workers, the Indian cane cutter, the Indian sugar workers, the Indian farmer, small farmer, really doesn't have a say in what's happening in government. And so what I try to do there, Alissa, and you're quite right, is to really go back to the history and to say, look, there's a certain development process in this country. There's a way in which power has been handled in the colonial times, in the post-colonial time, that we have to look at that and to really understand what is happening. At the end of the day, Chris, I am committed to something called class, because I think at the end of the day, that's where the problem lies. That it is the working people of this country who create the wealth, who do all the hard labor, but who continue to be down-pressed, who continue to be powerless. Okay? But they get caught up in this racial discussion, this racial discourse. And part of what I'm trying to do is to say, yes, we have got to talk about this racial identity. We've got to talk about racial discrimination. We've got to talk about the racial identity of the government. But more importantly, we've got to talk about how class plays into all of that.
Prior to the formation of the PPP, you still had the blacks and Indians were still largely among the working class. Yet you had the conflict, certainly in a historical context. So how does the class discussion help to advance the cause for racial equality?
Well, let's put it this way. One of the things we have to recognize about Guyana, and Guyana has pointed this out, that our history has been a history of meeting and parting. That the races, as Rodney pointed out, met around the 1905, right, met in terms of the 1930s and the big upsurge in the 1950s. So prior to independence, in spite of the suspicions by the races, they met and they forged alliances, class alliances against the colonial masters. Of course, with the imminence of independence, they parted. But they met again with Rodney. That's Rodney's biggest legacy, that he was able to bring the two races again together between 1974 and 1992. The working people of this country rose to the occasion and struggled vehemently against the authoritarian regime of the period. African people, African workers in Linden, African workers on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in Bobis, West Coast Bobis, marched and struggled with the Indian working class brethren against an African-dominated government. We must not forget that. So that there was class solidarity, there was meeting. Come elections, you mentioned, the report said the fairer the elections, the more. Come elections, and they've parted again. We've reached the junction now, Chris, that we've got to meet again. And this time when we meet, we've got to meet for good, because another parting, I don't think that Guyana will be able to survive it.
Do you see that as wishful thinking?
No, but I wonder if I can change it some. It's not. I don't think it's wishful thinking, but I think it does raise the question of how we get to that point. And I am from Florence, so every time people don't agree with what, I write into the Sabbath News. I'm a Guyanese who lives abroad and continues to be very concerned. I make no pretense about living here on the ground. When ones want to disagree, they send their letters to Sabbath News saying that all those people who live abroad should not wash them out on Guyana. So I make no pretense to be involved in Guyanese politics at that level. I must also profess, unlike David, a distaste for party politics and the politics of power, because it seems almost entirely corrupting at this stage. I'm not going to say that it isn't. I mean, obviously we're talking about elections, we're talking about the scramble for the state, and so it becomes a struggle now as we go into an election in 2006 that is necessary. Politically, I think we do have to find a political solution, a negotiated settlement, from where I stand, something that involves power sharing at its core fundamentally, and that is not about people jockeying for power. It is not about people jockeying for power in a way that does not attend to the needs of the majority of the Guyanese population is important. But the other part of it, I think, that has to happen is the work that takes place outside of party politics, that takes place when there is no struggle for election, that takes place, because what happens is that Guyanese are meeting on a regular basis, right, in their daily lives and their daily interactions, and then you have an election, and there's an eruption, and there's a parting, and then people come together again. I think between 1997 and then 2001 until now, I think we're seeing more violence in between the election time, and unfortunately, that is driving a lot of the fear and racial insecurity. It seems to be that a lot more sustained work has to be done among ourselves, within our communities, across our communities, for people to begin to see themselves as Guyanese and to talk to each other as Guyanese. And if I can just give you some examples, one of the things that worries me is about the young people who don't have a sense of the history. If we go back to let's imagine Shadi Jagan and Fort Burnham are alive and they're abusing up each other and everything, but the young people don't know that there was a time when Shadi Jagan and AUC Guyana and Fort Burnham, all of them were once struggling for the same sort of solution for Guyana. We're struggling against the same colonial master. That these were people who had conversations, people who were godfathers to each other's children. This, in a sense, is, as some people have said, is a big family quarrel in Guyana. We have a young generation that doesn't know that. We have a young generation that might believe that this is an Indian village and that is a black village, and doesn't know that you are only talking about a moment in history from the 1960s onwards. And that before the 1960s onwards, those villages were racially mixed, and that much of that migration happened as a result of that violence. You will have young people today who will say, well, Indians are somehow inherently qualified to be accountants, I know you're an accountant, or they're inherently qualified to be doctors or lawyers more than black people, and may not understand, for example, certain historical factors in which I have a great-grandfather, for example, who was, I believe, he used to work for the courts, he was an interpreter. He died at the age of 94, and I regret that I didn't know him much more. His name was Duncan Rohe, he was Indian, and he had to change his name, I believe. He also converted to Christianity. So a lot of people don't understand that Indo-Guyanese, for example, faced a lot of structural barriers in the colonial period in terms of getting into the civil service, in terms of getting public sector jobs, that going into accountancy or have nothing to do with some inherent genius of Indian people as opposed to African people. These have to do with the matters David talks about in this book, which are matters of political economy. I mean, I could go on with a number of these examples. These are examples. So this is the sort of work we need to do to understand what it is, where it is we've come to today, it seems to me. That is much more important, because if we do that work properly, then Guyanese people are not going to be fooled by politicians and their stupidness when they're jockeying for power, because it's not all about that.
You keep saying we. Who is the we? Are you drawing a distinction between the we, civil society, ordinary Guyanese, Indian, black Aboriginals, etc., and the political parties?
Well, I mean, part of why I write this book is to challenge Alissa and the we. Those of us who get some education, went to university, read big books and get this thing and so on, and teaching at a big university, and often we get so caught up on that because we have to be caught up on that. That's where your bread and butter is. That's how you think and so on. But I think in the Rodney tradition that we need to do some more of the work that you were talking. I think that work of education, that public education, has to be done by people like me and you. Those of us who have been educated on the backs of the working people, the poor people, that we've got to do that kind of education. And so this book, I choose to publish it in Guyana and publish it in the way it's published, because I see it as part of public education, popular education, which I think that we ought to be doing. And it's really a challenge to us to really take part of our time, part of our research, and give it back to the people in terms of popular education.
You, one of the early chapters of the book is racial insecurity is the problem.
And I say that, and let me say why I say that, because I think there is a theory that is being bandied around, the book written by Dr. Keane Gibson, for example, which argues that there's something inherent in Indians that make them behave a certain way towards black people. And there are Indians who have argued that there are things inherent. I mean, black people are inherently violent and so forth. And that's why, yes, and so forth. And I don't believe that I don't believe that we're moved by that naked racism. Of course, there are black separatists and Indian separatists. I have no doubt that there are pockets of those. But I think by and large, the racial behavior that you see in Guyana results from an insecurity on both sides. You see, both sides, Indians and Africans, neither of them want to be dominated by the other. Blacks don't want to be dominated by Indians, Indians don't want to be dominated by blacks. And so therefore, you start off by defending yourself against the domination. But after a time, you figure out that the best way to defend yourself against domination by the other side is to dominate the other side. And so therefore, you use the state and the government as a means of domination. So it's really that insecurity on the part of Indians that I don't want to be dominated by Africans. And on the part of blacks, I don't want to be dominated by Indians. And I think that drive a certain kind of behavior. You see, working people, the very people who met and who struggled together with Walter Rodney and the WP and the other forces in the anti-dictatorial movement of the 1970s and 1980s, these very forces, these very people, after 1992, were prepared to enter into a racial struggle again. And it has to do with that insecurity, because here is free and fair election. Indians are the majority, they win, and they say, okay, good, we're not going to allow those black people to get in again. And blacks are saying, well, we are going to be dominated, and the only way to defend ourselves is to try to win back the government. And so we have this struggle. So I think racial insecurity is indeed the problem. Of course, if racial insecurity festers and keeps going on over a period of time, it becomes naked racism over a period of time. So I reject the theory that Indians are inherently racial or blacks are inherently racial. I don't believe so. I think they behave racially, but they behave racially out of a sense of insecurity. That Africans say, look, we've been here before Indians. We humanize this place. We 400 years of slavery. You know, we're entitled to have some say in what's happening here. Indians say, but we came late, but we made a big contribution. We contributed towards the humanization of this place. And so therefore we need to have a say in what's going on. And it is that kind of demand to be respected, that kind of demand to be guaranteed security in this land that I think drives these two races. And I'm arguing, like others, like some others, and Alissa mentioned power share, I'm arguing that if we can guarantee, if we can work for a system of governance, if we can work for a political economy which guarantees security to both sides, then we can begin to deal with that kind of behavior. And so that's part of what I argue there.
I see you subscribe to the theory that racial insecurity is the problem, as opposed to, say, leadership of the caliber of Walter Rodney.
I think racial insecurity is certainly a huge issue. I was thinking when David said that, you know, as you talk, it strikes me that this solution, if we were to think of power sharing, and if we were to think of what some now see, for example, as the intransigence of the present situation, the present administration, or what some see, like myself, that the PPP and the PNC, as far as I'm concerned, are both sides of the same coin. They need each other. For there to be racial insecurity, you need the PPP in order for the PNC to exist, and vice versa. I understand myself as a black woman because, not just because I'm a black woman and define myself in certain ways, but also because of what I am not. And what I am not is not Indian. An Indian person understands themselves as Indian partly because they are not black, right? So that's what I mean when I say the PPP and the PNC in terms of the racial polarization in this country. Those parties require each other to a certain extent. And I think, unfortunately, people don't realize that they are dependent on each other for this negative situation to continue. The point I want to make, though, is that as David was talking about power sharing, it strikes me that on the one hand, it's very easy for us to blame the two parties and the last 28 years, but that really we are facing a situation where we are trying to confront a historical condition that is 400 years old. And it is clearly not easy. This makes me, you know, it's very dread, right? But it makes me somewhat more optimistic. It's weird that it's making me more optimistic when the battle is, but you realize that at the end of the day, this is a protracted struggle and situation we're dealing with. Let me give you an example. I can't remember the name of the officer, but it was an officer of the colonial state around the turn of the century when indentureship was coming to an end. And the British were very worried because now that you couldn't bring cheap Indian labor over from India, and indentureship was ending, and you had all these Indians who might want to return to India, and you had to, that was guaranteed in their contract, which was a civil contract enforceable by criminal sanctions. How were you going to keep them here? And you kept them there by offering them a plot of land, making sure that plot of land was contiguous, that is very close to a sugar estate, but making sure that plot of land wasn't so big that Indian farmer could become anything more than a small, not even a peasant, someone who had to partly supplement what they did on their plot of land with work from the sugar estate. And around that time, what was very interesting was there was this back and forth about what to do, I had found some historical records where, for example, there were explicit efforts on the part of the colonial state to ensure that blacks did not move into some of these Indian lands that were set aside, because there was an effort to keep the two races apart. And I say that because what we need to understand is that from the time that these two groups, blacks and Indians, come together in Guyana, they come together in a situation of controlled confrontation. They're not brought together in a situation. So working to come together, as David says, is working against the odds. Because the conditions under which Indians are brought into Guyana is an attempt to break the African village movement, which economist Rolf Farley wrote in the 1950s is one of the most successful village movements in the entire English-speaking Caribbean. So it's brought in to break the back of the African village movement, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that these two groups coming together now is against all historical odds. And the circle I was referring to at the early 20th century from a colonial official, an official of the British colonial state, says something like this. It's talking about comparing the negress and the coolie woman. And it ends, I won't go through that because that is offensive on its own, but it ends by saying the African and the Indian. It wouldn't have used those two terms in that period of time. It would have been something like the Negro and the Indian, or the Negro and the coolie. Historically, that's the terminology that has been used. But it said the African and the Indian are two entirely different races. They do not intermix. And then it ends. That, of course, is one of our greatest safeties in the colony when there has been any rioting. When I read this, it has never left me. It is always in my head. The black and Indian do not intermix. That is one of our greatest safeties in the colony when there has been any rioting. It is important because it points out to us how it was in the interest of the colonial states to keep these two groups apart and fighting at each other so that the colonial state could continue its work of plundering this country in order to get sugar exported to Britain. It was important in order for the colonial state to continue extracting the wealth of this country for the enrichment of others who were not those who were laboring for it. And it is important because we need to ask ourselves in the current period, if in that period we need to ask ourselves, who are the we in whose interest it is best that these two groups fight? Then we must also ask ourselves today, in whose interest is it best that African and Indian continue to see themselves in competition with each other? Because if that memorandum hints to us that when they fight at the bottom, it is this colonial elite that is winning, we need to turn around and ask ourselves today, when we fight against each other, when we see black man and coolie man, when we see those two groups as opposed to each other at the bottom, and we fight and kill each other, who are the we who are benefiting from the fact that we are kept apart?
David, can I ask you, as the author of this book,
and that's where the class issue
can I ask you to answer that question?
Who benefits?
Well, first of all, there's benefit at the global level. I mean, globalization, which really is international capitalism at its worst. And globalization is not new. I mean, Guyana has always been globalized. The fact that Indians and Africans and so on found themselves in this place called Guyana was a result of globalization. So what we've seen is a new wave, the most recent wave of globalization. So when we fight against each other, FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, is coming in next year. Sugar is practically gone. Banana is practically gone.
Well, the sugar regime.
Right. Right, the ACP regime. And so they benefit there, while we are fighting. Omai and hunt companies are taking the gold out. Brazilians are coming across the border and taking the gold out, and so on and so forth. So they benefit at that global level. And at the national level, there are also those who benefit here. There are those who benefit from the fact that you have instability, because political instability breeds a certain kind of behavior. So we have the narco state, the narco trafficking and so on, that has really become almost the norm in Guyana, and that comes as a result of the political instability that we've seen since 1992, because we are constantly fighting about race, Indians and Africans and so on, and the country is being taken over by drug lords. The country is being taken over, the Brazilians and Venezuelans and Surinamis are coming in. International capitalism is really elbowing and its way around. And so therefore, yes, those are the people who benefit. And the working people, the ordinary Indians and Africans and Amerindians continue to be powerless. In fact, one could argue they're probably more powerless today than they were during the colonial period. And so it is imperative that we stop this nonsense and begin to address the real issues. Curiously, the African working class finds common ground with the African middle class on many issues. And the Indian working class finds common ground with the Indian bourgeoisie class.
What is that common ground?
And that common ground is racial. That they see themselves as creating this strong defense against the other. And that is what we have to break. I think the genius of Walter Rodney was that he was able to break that. Now, we may not possess, or we certainly do not possess that genius, but what we do have is Walter Rodney's example, his work, his campaigns and so on, and we need to use those to begin to put a dent in this situation.
You see it as a problem because in Suriname, for example, you have the Hindustani party, and that's quite acceptable.
Intellectually, yes, I would say I see it as a problem. And I've had my differences with Ravi. I think a colleague and friend of mine, Sarah Abraham, and I had a public disagreement with Ravi then a number of years ago in the Starbuck News. At the same time, I think I have to say I have a lot of respect for Ravi Dev, and I think what I find very intriguing about Ravi is that in entering into party politics with Roar, he makes no pretense to be. He does not try to pretend to make Roar a multiracial party. One could say that there are other parties on the scene that pretend to be multiracial and are clearly not. In a sense, that has been one of the problems of Guyana. Roar is very clear that it is representing the interests of the Indian people. At the same time, Ravi makes it absolutely clear that he is not interested in Indian domination of Guyana, number one. He is also, I've heard him on a number of occasions, most recently a few weeks ago when I came for the Rodney groundings, and he was present in Cornelia Island, was one of the organizers coming together to get workers out for a session at Cornelia Island. He makes it very clear that, at least at that session, that he wanted to engage in discussions and that he thought it was very important, I think he has written about this publicly as well, for there to be groups representing, for instance, African Guyanese and African Guyanese interests in a political party forum. I don't necessarily agree that that's the way to go, but at the same time, I don't see Dev's politics necessarily leading to a situation where he's making a claim that Indians are better or that they should dominate Guyana or that they deserve to lead Guyana more than anyone else. I think he is saying, I represent these interests, this is my standpoint, and we need to talk about it. And he has also put the question of race on the table in a way that other parties have not put it. They hide behind this multiracial agenda when the two main parties are clearly not seen to be, at the very least, in the perception of Guyanese, they are not seen to be multiracial parties. This is my perception. You correct me if I'm wrong. Whatever the PPP and the PNC say or think, and they do this every week in the newspapers, for the majority of Guyanese people, the PNC represents black people, and the PPP is an Indian party. So in the perception of the Guyanese population, as far as I'm concerned, these parties are not multiracial. And it's the perception of the Guyanese population that at the end of the day is what is most important. It's irrelevant what these parties think they are or what they say they are. If the people don't see it that way, then they have a problem. And this is where I think Dev makes a real contribution because he puts it on the table and says, here it is, deal with it.
David, two of the issues which you challenged, your readers in the Starbuck News and now in this book, the Guide Branch Affair and Buxton.
And let David answer.
Yes.
That shows a lot of courage.
Yes. Well, yeah, courage, yes, I suppose so. Having come out of the struggles of the 1970s and the 1980s, that was not all that courageous compared with some of the things that you came up with. But no, I understand what you're saying, and I felt and feel very strongly about the Gadraj issue, because what it signaled was the final road to total decay of the political process in Guyana. When the state...
How do you relate that to the Buxton situation? Are you two sides of the same coin?
Well, okay, all right. So Gadraj and the Phantom Squad and its involvement there is popularly seen and perhaps correctly seen as a response to what was happening in Buxton. No, had there been a response organized by Indian people in Elmore or Annandale against what's going on in Buxton, I would have been against the violence, but I would have understood that. Now here is a government minister. Here is the state which is supposed to protect all citizens. Here is it, first of all, taking sides. Second, that it's stepping outside of the state apparatus, outside the police and so on, and stepping up its own army to go and kill people. No, that's not civilized at all. And no government should be allowed to continue in office when you cross that line. Clive Thomas calls it criminalization of the state. Well, that's the worst, that's the lowest you can go. And so it is for that reason that I feel very strongly about the Gadraj thing, as much as I feel very strongly about the Buxton thing. You know, I'm from Buxton, so I have an interest in that, a personal interest in it. But more than that, I think what was done to Buxton was cruel and unusual punishment.
Done by whom?
Done by persons who probably felt that they needed some kind of insurgency, some kind of militant or military response. I call it racial militarism, some kind of racial response, military response to what's happening in the country. And so therefore chose Buxton as the place to do that. Now, whether I agree that they should have had a military response is another question. My point is that when you go into a village and you upset relations in that village, and you turn that village into a criminal enterprise, you turn that village into a killing field, then what you're doing there is that you are punishing the people of that community. And so therefore I feel very strongly about that. And you know I've taken a very strong position along with Brother Yusi, Sister Ndaya. We spoke now against what happened in Buxton when others were not willing to speak out against. But the response by the state, I don't think was the correct response. And so therefore I see both those manifestations as an abomination and something that Guyana should avoid in the future at all costs.
In fact, you juxtapose the Gadraj affair in Buxton
in the book, yes.
Do you think the Buxton and the Gadraj affair exacerbated the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's without question. I think, you know, I'm not going to say much on this, but I think without question the point that David makes there is the one that requires emphasis, which is that both of these have occurred outside of the boundaries of what we might understand to be, I hate to use the word civilized conduct, but you use it, I will use it. But I think both of those, both the official in terms of the state response as well as the response on the part of those who may have felt that they were conducting themselves as resistance fighters, if that's what they call themselves, I think both of those were conducted outside of the boundaries of civilized conduct, and I think they have contributed to a situation that has degenerated. I think it has made it much more difficult to come back to a context where people can sit at the table, where we can have respectful conversations, where we can disagree, where we can find political negotiated settlements. I think it has led to a situation where violence increasingly is being seen as a way in which one solves one's problems. And I think very early on, and I and AUC and David had made the point that we need, and I had written this letter called Not in My Name, and a number of other letters have been written to the Established News saying that we need to stop this violence because the violence may appear to be against the other, whether the other was those in Buxton against others, or whether it was the state that was largely seen to be doing something that was then supported by Indo-Guyanese and some Afro-Guyanese or some African Guyanese as well. And those warnings were very early that violence is going to escalate. It's going to come back to haunt you. It's going to come back in ways that you have not seen, and I think we're beginning to see that now. The casual brutality, that's the name of the book, but the casual brutality and the way in which life in this country has been reduced to nothing almost, and that is particularly when you're poor and when you're poor and when you're young, or if you're a woman. So the incidence of domestic violence, which is just, you see these descriptions in newspapers, huge levels of brutality. Pick up the Kaiser News this morning. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. I had to tear off.
You can't take that.
Tear off the front page and tear it up and put it in the bin before I could read the newspaper, because there's a gratuitous picture of a black man. And my kids have a black father, right? So here's a black man shot dead. That's for my kid who has a black father to see on the front page of the newspaper. So the casual brutality, that level of violence, that to me, I left Guyana 20 years ago. I come home every year, at least 2 times, once a year, 2 or 3. That is something with which I'm completely unfamiliar. And I think for many Guyanese, this is a situation where long ago you used to say, okay, that happens, I don't need to stereotype like Jamaica and so, but I think Guyana, in a way, that's where the Buxton and Gatgard affairs, that's where it's leading us to that kind of acceptance of that violence as a part of our daily lives.
We probably have about 45 seconds left. This has made it very urgent. Is there a silver lining on the Gatgard and the Buxton affair? What hope does it offer?
Well, not to the Gatgard and the Buxton. Let's say the whole
situation. I think there is hope, Chris. As someone who continues to pay an interest in this thing, I think there's hope. There has to be hope. I think the emergence of new players on the political scene and the kind of excitement that has stirred among people, if only among sections of the people, I think is hope that something has to give. The recent Rodney groundings and the stir around that again points to the direction that Guyanese people are coming to realize that it's now or never, to quote from that.
I could also say that the writing is on the wall. The third force is there with Cameron and Raphael Trotzman, who I know quite well, and there's been a lot of
the Alliance for Change, not the third force.
There's been a lot of talk about whether it's working or whether it's not working, and when people comment on that, I have commented as well, they and I, we all missed the point that Guyanese people, the fact that there has been this groundswell, whether or not this party comes to anything, the fact that there was this groundswell of interest suggests very strongly that Guyanese people are fed up and they want a change, and I think that makes it necessary for us to listen to that and to make the intervention. The other last thing I want to say is it's unfortunate that it comes at the very end, but it's also that if we begin, as I said, not just thinking about party politics, but about the work that has to be done before, during, and after. After the election, there's always going to be work that continues to be done outside of the polarized party political. That's where you get people to sit down and listen. That's where you get women to sit and talk about the work that they do on a daily basis, to understand that they not no black work and no Indian work. When there's woman work is work, right? That's where the sort of conversations we have to continue to promote, that we have to continue to foster. That's where the real work of this country will lie.
Dr. Alissa Trotz, Dr. David Hinds, thank you very much for appearing on Glendale, and I really wish you success with your book, David, Race and Political Discourse in Guyana, A Conversation with African Guyanese. The book is available at
I know people don't like read now, but it's not long, right? 1,000 pages. Very well written.
Not 1,000 pages, 100 pages. $1,000 and so forth.
Thank you again, and viewers, thank you and good night.
Thanks.